Hey, deserving listeners, this is part 5 in which I react to Ethan and Trisha on Frenemies with Dr. Drew. I'm mainly going to focus on critiquing Dr. Drew's technique. Now, I don't know Dr. Drew's resume, but I do know that he's a medical professional and an addiction specialist. I don't know, but I don't think he is a relational therapist or a family therapist or a couples therapist is what they're calling this. Technically speaking, this isn't couples therapy because they're not a couple. They're friends and they're family members, so you would either call it family therapy, you could call it friend therapy, or you would call it relational therapy. You wouldn't call it couples therapy. But anyway, let's get to the YouTube video and see if I have anything to say.
Do you have any peer support, that kind of thing? People you can call when you start to ask? Okay. Yeah. So you're doing all the right stuff, right? You have a therapist, you have a DBT group, you've got peer support. I mean, it's, the fact that this happened from my perspective, not so surprising given what you tell everybody about yourself. Yeah.
Now, maybe he's right and maybe I'll agree with him. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, I suppose. But he is essentially in this moment saying it's her fault. He's not saying that explicitly, but he's saying, okay, great, you're in therapy, you're working on this stuff, meaning the stuff that caused their fighting, right? And okay, good, let's look into you some more. And yikes. Now maybe I'll agree, you're like, yeah, she's 100% the problem, she's the worst. But I didn't see anything, at least in this clip, in this video thus far, that would tell me that she's 100% to blame. They both seem like they're hurt and that they're covering it up with anger and hostility and they're triggering each other. It seems like they're both doing it to each other in this video. I don't know about other videos. Going in, now maybe Trisha likes this. Maybe she's just like, oh yeah, thank you for hearing me. Thank you for giving me this space. It might be that Trisha's fine with it. Let's see.
By the way, you're hanging in very, very well with this whole episode we're all going through here. You're not dissociating. Yeah. Which is kind of remarkable, right?
Thank you. I feel like we have worked on it since. I mean, I tell him like.
So that was good, pointing out a strength. I wouldn't word it that way, that she's not dissociating, but it's not necessarily an accurate way of putting it based on what she was saying anyway. But he's pointing out strengths, which is fantastic.
And then for the rest of it, and I just left because that was when he was saying the weaponizing thing, and I knew it was gonna set me off. It already did, and that's why I was being nasty about his wife and his kids and stuff like. And I was just like, okay, I need to leave because I know it's gonna get even worse.
But I don't take that stuff personally because I understand. Can I have a hug, by the way?
No, not really? Right now.
No, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's the
All right, so good. We see evidence that Ethan is caring and he wants to express it through a hug. She says no, and Dr. Drew is saying, yeah, let's. What I might say is, because that was a wonderful move by Ethan. It's one of the first times that he's actually exhibited care and compassion in this video. And so I would want to capitalize on it and say, because also the rejection that you get when someone says, no, I don't want to hug you, that can be very hurtful too. And then we would risk him escalating in terms of hostility. But I would turn to Ethan and I would be like, that was great that you wanted to hug her because tell me why, what was going on there? Well, I don't know. I just feel bad for her. Okay, that's good. It sounds like she doesn't want to hug, which is fine. She's just not in a physical place where she wants to do that. Can you verbally express your compassion? Because Ethan, great, good for you. You really want to capitalize on that. Anyway, let's see what happens.
Really?
It's going to seem weird.
Never, because you never hug me.
When you're dressed as one another, it's extra weird.
Yeah.
Well, then with a lack of in replacement of hugging you. Well, no, seeing you like this, I mean, it gives me a lot of insight to how vulnerable.
Dr. Drew, be quiet. Honestly, we were almost there. Even though Dr. Drew wasn't helping, Ethan was like, okay, fine, in lieu of not hugging you. So Ethan looked past the rejection of the hug and said, okay, in lieu of not hugging you, let me just tell you. And then Dr. Drew is interrupting. This is not a style thing. What? Why? Let's see why he wants to interrupt here. Let me rewind a little bit.
Well, then with a lack of in replacement of hugging you. Well, no, seeing you like this, I mean, it gives me a lot of insight to how vulnerable.
Yes, I think Ethan's saying, I see how tender this is. I apologize where I've triggered it too far. That's what she needs lots of right now.
Why would you do that? He is about to say it. Why are you stomping all over what he is doing? What is the impulse there? I'm guessing that Dr. Drew is worried Ethan is going to screw it up. That's just it didn't look like he was going to screw it up. And that he wants to save himself. I don't know. But if I had a trainee that would do this, I would watch this clip and I'd be like, tell me why, what was going on in your countertransference that compelled you to interrupt them as they were about to express compassion, which is the whole point of this session, right? It's not a real session, but anyway, so let's watch. So now Ethan's pushing past the interruption, and I'm guessing he's going to express compassion, even though Dr. Drew didn't ask for it, even though Dr. Drew tried to stomp it out. Let's watch.
No, I mean,
I think it's just like I always feel bad. Like I always.
So now she's interrupting, which of course is her prerogative. But if I were there, I'd be like, Trisha, just a second. I think Ethan has something really amazing to say right now. I don't know, but let's give him, because I think Ethan is a slower talker than Trisha. And this is actually a common thing in therapy that you want to manage as a therapist. Of oftentimes there's someone that's more verbal than the other person, or someone who's just quicker to say things. And left to their own devices, that the person who's quicker to say things will dominate the verbal space, if you will. And unless you develop some way of subtly helping people to balance that out, then you risk having the less verbal person just be bulldozed, which is essentially what's happening right now. Ethan is about to provide a golden... Now, for her, I'm guessing, because she said something earlier, she's like, I don't want a hug from you because you've never hugged me. And to hug me now would be disingenuous. So that tells me like she's perhaps wanted hugs from him, or something along those lines, and she's never got it. And so when you finally get what you've been longing for, sometimes it can be really painful because it reminds you of all the times you didn't get it. And so that's okay, and we would want to take care of that, but we wouldn't want that to be a reason not to not get it. You know what I mean? I would listen to that and be like, you have a lot of reasons to be upset about that. And can you accept that Ethan right now is trying to care about you? Can you accept that? Can you accept that he's trying? So that would be a very Satyrian moment. But anyway, let's see if we can bring it back to Ethan so he can actually fully express what I think is happening, which is compassion.
It's hard. I feel like people misperceive you and misunderstand you. I think people think that you're not self-aware, or that you're just like this wrecking ball, and that you kind of are just like this emotionless creature that just smashes everything up, and you don't think twice about it.
Yeah.
But it's clear to me now that you are very aware of how you...
So 2 thumbs up. This is the whole video. This is what I've been waiting for, right? You've heard me say this whole time, is that we're trying to get to a place where someone is expressing their pain and fear, and the other person is provoked naturally to have compassion and to take care of the other person. That's where the magic is. That's what will prevent conflict from happening in the future, or reduce it. And so I guess I'll commend Dr. Drew for getting there. I think part of it was in spite of him, honestly, but I think part of it was his help as well. So she led the way with her pain. She led the way with vulnerability. Ethan capitalized on that immediately. You saw that. He's like, oh, can I hug you? Okay, you don't want to hug me. But let me tell you. Then Dr. Drew interjects. Then he pushes past that. He's like, Dr. Drew, okay. And then he really wants to say, oh, I see you. I see your pain, and I commend you for being self-aware and all the things that he said. And you hear Dr. Drew trying to get in there. I'm just like, just stay out of it. Why do you want to mess with it? This is the whole point, right? Now, novice therapists will often do this because we want to feel useful as therapists, and of course that's a good thing. You want the service to be helpful to people. But on the other hand, when you're really insecure, you have a hard time just sitting back and just letting people talk. As a couples therapist, I know that as a relational therapist, I know that I've really arrived with a family or a couple when they start talking to each other in this way. As soon as they start doing this, I know, do not interrupt. Why would you interrupt a beautiful moment? Don't intervene. Let it happen. Let them see that they don't need you to do this, because they don't. They're doing it. They're capable of it. And to interrupt is to somehow like say, look, I'm a part of this too. Don't leave me out, or I'm useful, right? I'm doing this too. I've had sessions where couples will sit down on my couch and I'll say, how are you doing? And this is, years into couples therapy. They'll sit down on my couch and I'll say, how are things going? Or how was your week? And the whole session, they're talking to each other and I don't do anything. I don't do a single thing. And in the last few minutes, I have to wrap up the session. So I'll interrupt them and I'll say, all these beautiful things that I'm seeing, I'll just be like, I saw this, I saw that, I saw you do this, that was great, and I might even say, when I see a couple doing this where they don't need me, I know we have come a long way and we've worked really hard to get here, so good on you. So let's see if they can continue this. Maybe she will then say, you know what, and I'm sorry too to you. Maybe there'll be some mutuality here, which would just be fantastic. It would require Ethan to talk about his pain, which he hasn't done yet, but let's see what happens.
Is it not inappropriate for me to worry about my brother-in-law being in a relationship with her?
I mean, I don't know. I don't want to know the details of what, how bad it's gotten between them. That's really his decision, right? I mean, she is doing.
So this isn't my style. I'm not going to call this out as a bad thing to do in therapy, but my style would. So he just asked, I don't want to be insensitive here, but should I be worried about my brother-in-law because of her issues? Now, one of the reasons why he's saying it and framing it this way is because this is how Dr. Drew is essentially framing it, is she has emotional issues, and that's why they get into these fights. That essentially, I wouldn't be surprised if both of Ethan and Trisha walked away with that message in their mind, that Trisha has issues related to her trauma, and that's why they always fight. And it has nothing to do with Ethan at all, which I'm not convinced of. Who knows, but I'm not convinced of. Anyway, he's asking Dr. Drew, should I be worried? Well, if it was me, I would say, I don't know. There's no way for me to know. I don't know the relationship between Trisha and her partner. I don't know your partner. I don't know the history. I don't know. But tell me, what are you worried about? How about express that to Trisha? Tell Trisha what you're worried about. And let's talk about it with the two of you. What Dr. Drew is doing is he's trying to provide like an opinion on something that he couldn't possibly have an opinion about. So let's watch.
Like childhood trauma that I don't talk about with anybody, not even on my YouTube. So I kind of just don't want him to know everything, like, because my a lot of my parents, like both my parents don't really know all of it. So it's just like something I don't want him to know right now. Okay,
that's fine. That's fine. Then he should see a therapist as well. So again, because boundaries.
All right, that's great. I would absolutely get behind that recommendation, both for couples therapy for Trisha and Moses, and also for Moses himself. That's, you know me, I'm always telling people to go to therapy. So 2 thumbs up on that. But again, Ethan was expressing fear, and I would focus on Ethan's fear and helping Ethan and Trisha talk about Ethan's fear so that they can understand each other. Because if they understand each other, then maybe they'll understand, because who knows, but it seems like what Ethan is saying, at least in part, is a lot of the conflict, or some of the conflict I have with Trisha, has to do with my fear for Moses. I'm afraid for Moses, and that's why I end up getting in these fights with her. I could absolutely see that happening. How do you understand that fear for yourself, and how do you express it? Instead of saying, you're crazy and you are abusive to Moses, whom I care about, instead it would be something like, Trisha, I don't know your relationship with Moses, but I care about him, and I'm just kind of worried. I'm hearing some things that worry me. Can we talk about that? That's a very different approach, and it's much less likely to trigger the other person, right? Anyway, let's continue watching.
He goes, but there's also, my scandal that everyone hated me for this year, and it's still something that like triggers me in a really dark, deep way. And I talk with my boyfriend about it because only people close to me see it, is the dissociative identity disorder, which I've talked about before. And I saw a video about it on YouTube. So I made a reply being like, I think I might have traits of this. Like, this sounds like something that I do.
Okay, interesting. So she's said that she was traumatized early in her life. She hasn't given the nature of that because she wants to keep that private, and that makes total sense to me. And she also says that when she heard someone talking about dissociative identity disorder, she saw a video about it, she wondered, I think I might have some of this. That's totally possible. Now, I'd have to assess her and talk with her for a long time, but she's already mentioned some things that are in that direction. So dissociative identity disorder is a very complicated thing, and a lot of people think, even clinicians think it's like a fake thing. It's real, 100% real. Take it from me. I've treated people with it before. It is absolutely a thing. Now, can someone fake that they have it? Yes. Can someone think they have it when they don't actually have it? Yes. But people do actually suffer from it. Essentially what's happening is that when you're young and you're being massively traumatized, usually when you're very young, and it's persistent trauma, persistent abuse that you're going through in life, your brain decides that it's easier to section off different alters or parts of the self, if you will, so that those other parts can be protected. So one part can be the person who gets abused, so that the three other parts don't have to experience the abuse. And because of how effective the brain is at compartmentalizing those memories and those personality traits, the other parts literally have no memory and no feeling and no effect of the trauma. The trauma only affects that one part. Of course, you can get into debates as to do the other parts actually have some negative effects from the trauma anyway, but that's why it develops. And it seems to be that young people are capable of doing this. If you experience no trauma, no terror when you're young, and then you go through a series of 5 years from the age of 20 until 25 and it's terrible, it's extremely unlikely that you're going to develop dissociative identity disorder. There seems to be something about young children with how plastic their brain is. Maybe we even adapted it. We evolved that trait of like, if you are in a very traumatic situation as a young person, it's better to have a part of your brain take over or to splinter the self into several different alters so that you can function in life, because you're trying to deal with one way of looking at dissociative identity disorder is that it's a logical answer to a very screwed up situation, that you develop a way of coping with a very, very difficult situation. And without your dissociative identity disorder, you wouldn't have survived. And people who suffer from dissociative identity disorder will say that, especially once they get treatment and they understand their alters a lot better. She was talking about how earlier when she gets triggered, that she sees red and she becomes another person and she will attack. And then later on, she'll regret it and she'll be like, whoa, who is that person? So there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is that it's a mood issue related to bipolar or depression or something. Another is that it's a dissociative state and that it is either dissociative or it's in a dissociative identity. Some people are categorized with dissociative identity disorder who just have two. They have their mainstream alter, and then they have this other alter that they rely on when things are going very difficult for them. Now, another way of looking at it is through the internal family systems model. I won't go into the whole thing. So there's a lot of different ways of conceptualizing it. But anyway, just using this as a jumping off point to talk about that. So let's continue watching and see what she has to say.
And when you talk about the dissociating, which you mentioned earlier, you were suicidal in a dissociative state, right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of more consistent with the borderline stuff, as well as the rages and the inability to control yourself in certain times. That's all sort of borderline stuff. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, but I don't know if he has enough information to go off from that. Maybe he does, and I don't know the point in going down this road. I mean, she has a clinician that knows her very well. If I were in Drew's position, I wouldn't go here. I'd just be like, that's why I'm not actually commenting that much on what she's saying, because she has a therapist. She can talk with that person about how to conceptualize her issue. And there's nothing in this video that gives me enough information to comment on personality disorder or anything. He seems to be concluding that she's on the borderline spectrum, and maybe she agrees with that. But anyway, let's continue watching.
And the DBT is designed to treat that. Yeah. Right? So you're in a good therapy for that. Whether or not you have dissociative identity disorder, people argue about whether that even exists. Mm-hmm. Sometimes just people see that as severe borderline.
They don't argue if it exists. The only people who argue if it exists are people that don't know. It's like people arguing about climate change. No. When you talk to the experts, 98% of the experts, there's no argument. the climate is changing. There's no argument. Yeah. Do people online argue? Do clinicians who have no idea what they're talking about argue? Yes. But if you talk to trauma experts, dissociation experts, I don't know the percentage, but the vast majority completely accept with no argument that dissociative identity disorder exists.
Borderlines can present differently to different people and differently in different mood states. And you're aware you're doing that.
Now, that is true. That what he just said is true. I won't go into the weeds on it, but, I can get behind what he just said there.
Right? And the idea, hopefully in therapy, is you sort of integrate all those parts so they don't come apart when you have really intense feelings. Make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, and that's, yeah. And my therapist had told me the same thing. He's one that doesn't necessarily believe in like the dissociative of like going into different alters, because I don't have.
I've seen some crazy stuff, and you don't have anything like that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how Dr. Drew would be able to. He basically just said, you do not have dissociative identity disorder. There's no possible way that Drew would be able to know that. No possible way. We're hearing from her anyway that she is under the understanding that her therapist also does not endorse the notion of I want to be clear. Dissociative identity disorder has been studied for decades, and it has been in our diagnostic manual for decades. There is no debate. The research is all there. Somehow in common culture, which infiltrates the clinical culture, this notion that dissociative identity disorder doesn't exist happens. But no expert in trauma that I know of, no expert in dissociation that I know of, questions the existence of the disorder, especially when you actually work with people.
So I think that's why people are like, no. And so when people said no, then I did troll and make a video where I started going into alters if that's what people wanted to see. But
would I conceptualize her after assessing her with dissociative identity disorder? I don't know. From the sound of it, if I did go in that direction, if I did conceptualize her in that way, I wouldn't say she suffered from a typical presentation of dissociative identity disorder, because she's really talking about two states where she has her regular state and then her angry state. But, and to be clear, when we're talking, I use the word conceptualize. You hear me say that. Would I conceptualize her that way if I were to assess her? Because that's all we're doing as clinicians. We're hearing people tell us stories, and then we're conceptualizing what they're telling us. There's no blood test for dissociative identity disorder. There's no blood test for borderline. It is a clinical call that you make. And if you line up 10 therapists, you're going to get different judgments usually, especially when it comes to things like borderline. For Dr. Drew to say, like, you don't have this without having assessed her is silly.
But when it's about something you're trying to be honest about, then that's really upsetting when you get that negative attention.
I don't like negative attention, period.
You don't
now.
like it at all.
I used to like it, but I don't need attention anymore. I don't make my money off YouTube. I don't make my money doing.
I don't think. Let's drill in a little further. Ethan, for some reason, this sounds like something important to you. I don't think you're quite getting it across, and I don't think Trisha's quite answering it.
So this is good. I don't know where Drew is heading, but I like where he's heading. Ethan was like, so you like negative attention. Do you know the difference between negative and positive attention? And they're just having a conversation around that. I think what Dr. Drew is picking up on, which is fantastic, I think, is that Ethan is concerned about her, that Ethan cares. And so Dr. Drew is trying to zero in on that as a way of helping them bond and have less conflict. Let's see what happens.
But it results from, like, the DID and the trans thing resulting from not people like you, but people saying, well, you said you were a chicken nugget 7 years ago when you had a meth problem. It's like, that's why, because they can't take it seriously from them.
Can I also add?
I know the difference, though. I'm aware.
Those are usually your most popular videos, too.
Yeah. And like I said, the trans one,
I don't know what Dr. Drew was getting at, and I don't even know what Ethan is getting. Is Ethan trying to put her down? It sounds like Ethan is trying to say, hey, you need to stop being so interested in negative attention. I don't know what Ethan's point is.
Interested in and what I'm wondering. See how I say that, Ethan? I'm wondering.
What I'm wondering. Yeah, I'll never get there, but
is
I
know
you, doctor.
What I'm wondering is if you can own some of the stuff, some part of what brings on the negativity. Oftentimes, ever heard of traumatic reenactments?
Dr. Drew is right to bring this up in that when we're victimized repeatedly, particularly, we develop a schema of we deserve to be abused, we deserve to be punished. And there's various different ways this manifests. But one of the ways it can manifest is in our adult relationships, we will cause other people to feel justified in harming us. Now, we don't want to victim blame, because if someone harms Trisha online, that is on them. The harmer is the one that did something wrong, right? It's not Trisha's fault. You know, if she does something on the internet that causes people to criticize her, that's one thing. But to harm her or to attack her is a different thing. But because we know that if we do certain things, we will provoke that victimization of us, then we are trying to get the world to agree with how we see ourselves. We see ourselves as victims. We see ourselves as deserving of abuse. We might even relate to other people in some way of like, well, at what point are you going to abuse me? Because that's how I know how relationships, that's comfortable to me. This is all subconscious, by the way, mostly. Another is that if I provoke you to abuse me, then at least I had some power over the situation. Because for me to just wait here in an inert way, waiting for someone to abuse me, not only am I powerless because I'm being abused, but I'm also powerless over when the abuse happens. Whereas if I can provoke the abuse to happen to me, then I'm being abused, which is terrible. But at least I'm getting a little bit of power sense out of it because at least I provoked it. And there's also a bit of a fantasy that the self gets into because the self is trying to say, well, I brought it on myself, so I deserved it. It's normal that this is happening. Because the self is trying to wrestle with the injustice and the pain. And the self, the ego, will develop all sorts of fantasies and weird defenses to deal with a very difficult situation. So I think Dr. Drew is now trying to bring up the topic of, have you considered your impulse online to be related to the trauma that you were going through? Because I do know that knowing his career, I do know he's talked with a lot of abuse victims. And I do know that he knows that when people are abused, they will sometimes reenact that later in life. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not blaming the victims when they are re-victimized. The person, if someone, it happens to me all the time. Clients will come in with this schema and they'll try to get me to abuse them. They'll try to get me to harm them. And I just don't do it. One, because I'm a therapist and I know better. But two, because I don't have an impulse to hurt anybody. I don't want to victimize anybody. So the fact that, so if I did abuse someone, even though they were provoking me, that's on me. That's still my fault. I'm still abused. I'm saying that it's not automatic for someone to abuse. So when you go on YouTube and you exhibit this provocation, a percentage of people are going to target you because they have a similar trauma from when they were kids. And that's another thing that will develop out of trauma and out of victimization is this idea of, you're 3 years old, you're being traumatized. And one of the ways that you deal with that terrible situation is you internalize the abuser and you say, I am an abusive person because, I'm seeing what it's like to be powerful. And I actually need that person because they're my parent or my grandparent or my older sister or something. And I need them and I respect them and I fear them and they have power and I'm jealous of them. I'm envious of what they have. So I'm going to be that way. And the next person that comes my way, I'm going to abuse them because that was modeled to me. And that's how I know you're supposed to relate to people. I see that it's okay to do that. And I have been made to feel powerless. So how do I balance the scales? Well, I'm going to get power over other people. And so you have all those people online, which is a small percentage of society, and then she puts this stuff on the line, and then she provokes those individuals, and they're both reenacting their pasts. It's very clear to me when I see stuff like this happening online. So Dr. Drew is good to get into this.
We drift into relationships and circumstances where we recreate the same thing that was so upsetting to us as a child. Mm-hmm. So you might look at some of these negative interactions to see if there's something you're attracted to, which it's all about attraction from the trauma. Mm-hmm. You get attracted to that you can watch out for that sets you up to re-traumatize yourself and get all that negative attention.
So good. I wouldn't word it that way because, again, a takeaway can be it's your fault. that the people who attacked you online, and because she was talking about stalkers and people who were threatening to kill her. So what Dr. Drew just said, although is absolutely true, unless you give the caveat of the way I gave it earlier, you can very much give a message to someone that it's your fault, that it's not the stalker's fault, it's not the person who threatened your life, it's your fault because you're attracted to that sort of thing, which is not the case. And of course, if you're historically an abused person, you believe it's your fault anyway. So when someone says basically what Dr. Drew was saying, like, well, it's your fault that these things happen, you just, yeah, totally fits with my schema that I'm always to blame and that it's always my fault. It's not her fault that someone stalked her. It's the stalker's fault. She can do all the provocations online she wants. That doesn't mean it's okay to stalk somebody. Doesn't mean it's okay to threaten someone's life. It's just not okay.
I feel horrible. I do apologize for being so nasty, like from the pill thing, because I know how that feels, and I apologize for trying to be tough and badass and talking about Hila.
Fantastic. 2 thumbs up to Trisha. She's apologizing too. This is great. They finally got there. That's just fantastic. Good to see. And I like it. You make mistakes, you apologize. I do it all the time. People apologize to me. I apologize to other people. It's the most wonderful thing you can do in life.
And everything, I always feel bad. Like, I feel bad about it when it's not in a joking mode. When it wasn't, when you triggered me, I felt bad. When I was like, good luck trying to get your wife pregnant. Like, it was just a mean thing. I don't know what it was, and I'm sorry. And I feel bad. Like, that's not me.
Thank you.
It's not the last time.
I do know
not the last time you'll do it.
So Dr. Drew has this thing where he wants to interject. They're having a wonderful moment, and Dr. Drew just wants to get in there and do something. It's like, just don't let them have it.
It's too much for you. This is too much for you guys.
It's a lot.
Well, the good news is that we're done.
Okay, good.
It's a lot, but it was a privilege. It was a privilege.
I feel like we're ending this show on a better note than we've probably done.
I feel great. I was very excited to have you here, Dr. Drew. No, oh my God.
Is it really for me to want to squeeze my titty?
No. One of these days.
One of these days, yeah.
We didn't get into any of the physical boundary stuff. That's all the topic.
That's way down the line.
Yeah, that's way.
But one thing at a time.
Everybody.
Yeah, we have a whole crew.
All right, well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone, tell me what you think in the comments. And please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.